today we're going to focus on one of the key solutions, one of the most promising initiatives that we've seen take root across the country, and that's social housing. That's publicly financed mixed income housing, supported through a social housing production revolving loan fund. And there's so many advantages to this concept. And it's not just a concept, it's been proven. It is working in Montgomery County, Maryland. The political leadership of the state of Rhode Island, both the Speaker, Senate Pres, and Governor have committed to advancing the social housing production model there. The city of Atlanta is moving in this direction. Paul has been embedded with many different housing authorities and housing development professionals working on this concept. And just yesterday, when Governor Healy introduced the $4 billion housing bond bill, I think we were all really excited to see that the Healy-Driscoll administration included a social housing pilot program in that bill. So I'm very excited for that. So without further ado, I want to introduce our special guest for the day, economist Paul Williams, who came up from New York City. I'll say a word or two and then we'll all clap. I started working with Paul about a year ago. I think I was just a fan of yours on Twitter. I found myself retweeting your housing analysis and finding it so promising and so I think important in this moment. So I reached out to you and just very graciously, Paul started working with me to draft legislation and act introducing and facilitating the Massachusetts social housing program. We were grateful to Chair Arciero and Chair Edwards. We finished drafting our bill in May, and then the Housing Committee, and thank you to John from the Housing Committee for being here. The Housing Committee scheduled it right on the public housing hearing, which was our first substantive hearing this year. Appreciate the fact that we emphasized public housing right at the start of the term, and it made sense because social housing is a form of public housing, as Paul will explain. And to go from drafting the bill in May, having the hearing in June, and now to see, I think, the Healy-Driscoll administration support the concept as well has been really encouraging. So that's my intro. I'm so grateful to Paul, who is the executive director of the Center for Public Enterprise in New York City. He got on the train, I think at 5 this morning to be here with us. So let's hear it for Paul. I'll take
Morning, everyone. Do we have, does this move down?
It's supposed to.
Just click on it, give me 1 second.
Oh, it does. Great. Okay. It kind of, can we zoom in one on
Absolutely.
that frame? So that get the jump 1 page. The little plus sign. Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry, we're gonna see a second. Let's see. Can you do one more?
Sure.
Okay. Now introduce you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I'm really excited to come up here and talk to you all about this housing production model that is becoming more and more popular around the country. There's cities, states, housing authorities, housing finance agencies that are starting to see the benefits of models like this after we've had some really innovative kind of first leaders like the Housing Opportunities Commission of Montgomery County, Maryland, kind of take the first steps at deploying a model like this. So it's really exciting to see how much excitement there is in Massachusetts to create some kind of social housing production fund for mixed income housing. So this is a slideshow that I have, and I'm Paul Williams. I'm the executive director at Center for Public Enterprise. Before I started this organization, I went back to school, did a graduate degree in economics. Before that, I worked for the City of Chicago Housing Department. Before that, I was at another think tank. So I've been doing work around this area for about a decade. So So this is a kind of adapted presentation. I've added some Massachusetts specific slides for all of you here based on, what we know about how things could move with social housing based on the governor's bond bill and a number of other things. But this is really the point of this presentation, and then obviously we'll do question and answer, is to look at what is the problem in affordable housing production and overall housing production, and what do tools like this, like the revolving loan fund, do to solve those affordable housing production problems. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the first thing to look at is what are the constraints that we face on affordable housing production today. The primary constraint is that you have to pay for affordable housing, and we pay for it with low-income housing tax credits, project-based vouchers, bond volume cap, and most of these programs are federal. Sometimes we have state programs that support affordable housing production, like in Massachusetts, but these are all from appropriations, and they are constrained and limited. And so what you get in basically every state in the country is every single dollar that comes from the federal government gets used and spent every single year. There's not extra affordable housing dollars that are just kind of sitting there from the federal government. Every dollar gets used every year. So if you want to build more, if you have more people who want to build affordable housing, they're all just competing for those same dollars. So that leads us to the idea that if we want to increase affordable housing production, let's try and create a tool that doesn't require the use of these federal subsidies. And that was the idea that Montgomery County came up with, that we'll get into in just a minute. And then, of course, there's other kind of legal constraints. Public housing authorities face the fair cloth cap, which limits the number of traditional Section 9 public housing units that HUD will pay for. And then there's also just general economic risk, right? If there's recession risk, investors aren't going to want to invest. And then you have a situation where housing permits, housing starts start to fall, like we're seeing today. And then this is just a kind of general trend with public housing authorities. Public housing authorities were given a ton of investment from basically 1937 through about 1990. And those dollars all started to kind of fade away in the 90s era reforms. And now, instead of largely, there are some housing authorities that still have their kind of public housing stock. I know Boston Housing Authority and Cambridge Housing Authority have some. New York City Housing Authority famously is actually the largest landlord in the United States of America. Not just the big public housing authority, but NYCHA owns more apartments than any other single owner in the United States. But largely public housing authorities now just do Section 8 voucher delivery, right? The vouchers come in from HUD and they give the vouchers out to the next person on the voucher rating. But these public housing authorities have a ton of capacity. They have statutory authority, they have access to federal financing resources. There's a lot of things that they could be doing if they were given more tools to and given more instruction or opportunity to do new things. So enter Montgomery County, Maryland. The public housing authority in Montgomery County, Maryland is called the Housing Opportunities Commission. A few years ago, they came up with a program that is a revolving loan fund they call the Housing Production Fund. And basically what they do is they use that fund to invest in projects that they're building, just short-term construction loans into the projects that they build without using any other federal subsidies. So no low-income housing tax credits, no project-based vouchers, no bond volume cap. They continue to do low-income housing tax credit projects. They also do project-based voucher projects. They also do traditional public housing projects. But this is something on top of all of that they're able to do additionally, because they've come up with this new tool that doesn't require adding in federal resources. So, you know, it's an additive thing, right? It's instead of taking the same pie and slicing it up a little bit differently and giving a little, you know, this piece to that person and that piece to this person, they've just created another pie, right? That's producing more affordable housing on top of what they already do. And that's what is unique about a program like this. It's not putting additional claims on the same pie that we've used before. So now I'll get a little bit into the kind of mechanics of the financing, and happy to take questions later, but let's save them for the end. I don't have all that many slides. I'll try and move a little bit quickly. So the way it works is very similar to what is has been talked about in Massachusetts, both with Rep. Connolly's bill and with what the governor talked about yesterday. HOC in Maryland issued a taxable bond to capitalize this revolving loan fund. And so they issue the bond and they have a bucket with $100 million. Now, when you build a building that doesn't have low-income housing tax credits or, you know, other conventional federal subsidies in it, you will have maybe 60 or 70% of the project will be a construction loan, just a big mortgage. And then what you have left is the big gap that has to be filled. In a private building, that's typically filled by private equity. In a affordable project, that's typically filled by low-income housing tax credits. In the Montgomery County approach, with this housing production fund, they make a short-term loan to cover that gap from their revolving loan fund, but it's only a 5-year loan, right? It's not like a 30-year mortgage. So the money, you know, like realistically if you're making a 30-year loan from like an affordable housing fund, you're never going to see that money again, right? This is a 5-year loan where it goes in, and then when the building is built and the tenants are in the building, that loan gets bought out and paid back into the fund. And then it can go out to a new project the very next day if you have one ready. And so that's what's unique here is you're kind of taking the private model of debt, private equity, but you kind of yank the private equity person out and you're like, actually, we don't need that capital. That's expensive. We have this revolving loan fund that we're going to use to cover that same piece in the capital stack. So this next slide, you can kind of see the percentages in the stack. I don't know if you can, it's a little small. Sorry about that. But so you can see on the left side, just for the construction and lease up phase, right? In Montgomery County, they'll work with a partner just for the construction phase. And so you can see the blue biggest piece is a construction mortgage, 70%. And then this housing production fund that they have covers 20%. It's that orange slice. And then you have these little investments from the housing authority and from a partner. And then once the building is done, after year 4 or 5, roughly, you take the housing production fund out and you get a permanent mortgage, and then the housing authority is the permanent owner. And that's the way that they do it. And what it allows them to do, essentially, the affordability level is not that they're able to get is not like a determined policy kind of thing. Basically, the way they look at it is, if I build a market rate building, just purely market rate building, I build it, I get a certain amount of money. My costs every year on my debt service and my operations are a certain amount of money. So the difference between those two pieces, right? Say you get $2 million a year in rent and you only pay $1 million a year in operating costs. You have $1 million that you're bringing in that's going to profits or returns on equity or all of these different things. what they do is they just plug affordable units into the building until that number of operating income number is down to essentially at cost, right? So whatever the highest level of affordability that's achievable in a project, they will just get that number, right? And in some cases, you know, it's 30%, some cases it's 40% at, you know, 50% AMI. But again, with what they're doing, they're building, say, you know, a 200, 300 unit project. So if you're getting 30 or 40% affordability at 50% AMI, you're getting 100 units of 50% AMI affordable apartments, and you didn't spend a single low-income housing tax credit, a single project-based voucher, a single anything, right? All of your traditional programs are still producing at the current levels. You're just now getting hundreds or thousands of additional affordable units on top of them. I guess I should have gone to this slide, but basically this is the, you know, kind of idea I was talking about with the different levels, right? If you have some market units in the building, those are bringing you in additional income on top of your operating cost. And then if you have units that are rented at very affordable rates, you know, 50, 60% AMI, then you're still able to kind of hit that break-even level of cost that you need to be able to, you know, pay your mortgage by having some above and some below, right? That cost level. And then, oh, we kind of got, can we zoom back out? I don't have control of the, yeah, okay, that's perfect. Great, thank you so much. Okay. So of course, there are a number of things you can do to increase the affordability in this. So in Montgomery County, for example, they've got some projects that they do with this revolving loan fund where they'll also put in conventional subsidies like low-income housing tax credits or other public housing subsidies on top of it to get even more affordability, right? But the point is that, you know, they don't need that to get a significant amount of affordability. And if they have more of that subsidy on hand, yeah, you can stack it in and put it on top of this. But again, the idea with it is that it's expanding the pie of available tools to build affordable units. And here's some other idea. So, you know, you can pair it with additional rental assistance like project-based vouchers. And this last piece, reinvest future equity. This is the piece that makes the public ownership important, that I think is unique and is a little bit harder for some people to swallow, just because of, you know, there is some aversion that people have in government or from historical experiences to public ownership of things. But what's different about these projects is that, you know, when we talk about public housing that fell into disrepair in the 80s and 90s when it was unfunded, the problem that public housing faced is that the rents that were collected from, you know, the building was 100% people in the very bottom tier of the income spectrum. So you had basically all of the lowest income people in a city or neighborhood all in the same building. And obviously the rents that are affordable for them to pay are not even close to enough to maintain that building. So the building was reliant on federal subsidy streams to keep up maintenance and operations. The difference with these types of projects that Montgomery County is building is that they're not reliant on that. The building has market rate rents and higher and moderate income rents in the same building. And so the building actually is making money. And so from Montgomery County Housing Authority's point of view, they're like, what, this building is making me money. It would be fiscally irresponsible for me to give it away to somebody, right? I want to get that return and build equity in this apartment that I own, so that I can then say refinance in 10 years, take equity out and use it to invest in another mixed income affordable housing property. right? So from their point of view, having building equity in these assets is part of the long-term strategy of building even more affordable housing in Montgomery County. Because it's equity and there's all kinds of things that you can do, right? You build equity, you can refinance and take equity out. You can also just refinance and add even more affordable units into the building, right? As you lower your annual debt service costs. So there's all kinds of benefits to having that public owner on the property, from their point of view. Let's see, how are we doing on time, Mike? You okay?
We're doing pretty well. And,
Okay.
Let me recognize Representative McGonigal and Representative Kay Khan who have joined us.
Great, thanks for joining.
Did I miss anyone?
Okay, I'll hop through. I've got just a couple more. This one, just quickly, this is from a presentation Montgomery County gave to the Housing Authority gave to their county board last year. Basically, what they show is that with their revolving fund, over this coming decade, over the 2020 to 2030 decade, they believe that they'll essentially be responsible for 20 to 25% of all of the housing production in the county, with just a $100 million revolving loan fund. They're building a lot. Like this is scale. They've got a number of like really significantly sized projects that they're going to be announcing in the coming months. They've got a 1,500 unit multi-phase project adjacent to a transit station along the Red Line in Montgomery County that it's public enough to talk about, but it's not like there's been a news story yet. So they're producing at scale. This one I can skip for now. We can come back to it. So now this question of who else is doing this? Where else is this happening? Is this just Montgomery County? No, it's not. So Atlanta, the city of Atlanta, my organization worked with them past 6-8 months on creating a city program to essentially replicate what Montgomery County does. So they have a housing authority in Atlanta called Atlanta Housing, and they spun a kind of sub entity off of that housing authority that they're calling the Atlanta Urban Development Corporation. And they also issued a bond, created a revolving loan fund. There's just $40 million for the city, and they're giving that revolving loan fund to the Atlanta Urban Development Corporation. And the reason this came about in Atlanta is they did a huge citywide land inventory of all the publicly owned land that was underutilized, like basically just vacant public lots. And they had a ton of them, and they said, what should we do with all of these lots? And one of the tools that they came up with to make use of those underutilized lots was to create this program. And so they also gave the Atlanta Urban Development Corporation, this new housing authority, several dozen vacant public lots that it's now has access to and is going to use to develop this kind of mixed income housing. So they're getting off the ground. They hope to, I think they'll probably announce their first project either by the end of this year or early next year. Remains to be seen. And then my organization, Center for Public Enterprise, we have a small community of practice of public housing authorities, housing finance agencies around the country who are interested in or are starting to develop a program to implement models like this. So HUD is a participant. Chicago, places like Chicago, New York City Housing Authority, New York City Housing Development Corporation, Atlanta, Boston Housing Authority is interested, Bay Area Housing Finance Agency, Ohio Housing Finance. So there's housing finance agencies and public housing authorities all around the country who are kind of participating in this group to learn about how to do this and have some interest. And then there's a slide on Massachusetts, some considerations. Here, there's a ton of housing agencies in Massachusetts. It remains to be seen what's the right, in Atlanta, right, you have this situation where you have a housing authority, you created a sub-entity that you spun off to make this program work, you gave it a revolving fund. That's different from the way it works in Montgomery County. That's different from the way that it's going to work in Massachusetts if this is approved by the legislature. There's a ton of different agencies that can be used and kind of combined to get the right institutional arrangement and the right interagency coordination to make the most of a model like this. So, right, you've got mass housing partnership, mass development, and then you've got a number of sophisticated public housing authorities like Boston Housing Authority and Cambridge Housing Authority, Somerville Housing Authority. So these kind of considerations of if you want to have statewide impact, you probably want a state level agency to be kind of administering the fund, and maybe doing some of the development work, particularly in places, right? Like Boston probably doesn't need help from, Boston Housing Authority doesn't need help on doing the development work, right? Boston Housing Authority knows how to do development, but maybe somewhere in the western part of the state, if you want to have a project like this, they might need some sophistication from an organization like mass development. And so these are the kind of considerations to think about. How do you take, if you get a fund, how do you then deploy it and turn it into these units based on your kind of institutional arrangement in the state? I know that was a lot. I am more than happy to answer questions or go back to slides, or you have.
First, let's hear it from Paul. Let's open it up for questions. If there are.
I'm Emerson. I work in Senator John Thumbs. Just quickly, how old is kind of the style of a fund that's happening in Montgomery County? I know the article about Atlanta said European style of housing, so
Yeah.
like that's relatively new to the US.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I guess, for a little bit more context. So there are a bunch of ways that social housing, things called social housing, are financed all over the world, right? And really in a lot of European countries, like the programs that we have, like low income housing tax credit, places around the world, like the OECD refers to our LIHTC program as social housing. They're like, that's America's social housing program. So, all the terminology is all like a little bit weird, right? But a model like this, where you have kind of public financing and a public role in development and have this kind of mix of incomes that's not like hyper targeted in the way that traditional public housing was back in the 1940s, 50s, 60s. That is what is more European style about this approach, right? Like if you go to the city of Vienna, something like 60-70% of people live in social housing. So it's not like a targeted thing. It's like the majority of people live in these apartments that are built with public financing and public backing. That's just the way that housing is built in Vienna. And similarly, so in places like Helsinki and a lot of like larger European cities, and as well as Singapore, right? Those are all around the world that have programs like this. So yeah, does that answer get at what you were asking
Sure,
about?
yeah.
I mean, but I guess you were asking how
more of the
Maryland.
Or is that kind of the first
They're kind of
this fund?
Yeah, I mean, they're the first to do what's specific about this model is using a revolving fund to cover the construction gap in financing a project, right? Like, and essentially what that's doing is like the reason you can't get a mortgage for 100% of your construction project is because construction is risky and no mortgage lender wants to give you 100% of your capital. They'll give you 70%, but they're like, go find somebody else who will give you the remaining piece. And they'll charge you more because they're going to take the downside if risk goes wrong. What this fund does is it's like, I'll cover that riskier construction piece with a public revolving loan fund. That's what HOC said they were going to do, right? And that's what's unique about this. And to be clear, that's not the way that it's necessarily done in other places around the world, right? Like, I mean, every country that does social housing does the financing kind of tricks in a different way. There's no one way. This is just a way that makes a lot of sense in the American context, particularly for PHAs and HFAs.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just kind of butting off of that question, how do you think the model would change city to city? Like you were kind of talking about Western Massachusetts compared to Boston, how do you think the financing into those funds are different?
I mean, ideally, there wouldn't be all that much difference city to city. I mean, because the financing is going to kind of stay the same no matter what. The differences are going to be, you know, in Western Mass, the rents on the market rents that are cross subsidizing are probably not as high as the market rents are in Boston or Cambridge, right? But also potentially construction costs are not quite as high as they are. And right, because you have, these are the two kind of, right, your main cost is what is your per square foot cost for building this project? Your main source of revenue is what are the rents that are available to charge here. And so, you know, you don't want those to be too out of whack, right? But like a kind of rule of thumb for this is if private development is happening, that means that private developers are able to be making money. And it also means that, and realistically, they have private equity investors who are covering the construction risk for them and charging a high price. If all of that's happening, then this will work too, right? Because it's essentially doing the same thing. It's just taking away some of that construction risk. So if private development's happening, this can also happen. It's a kind of good rule of thumb. If you have a part of the state where the market just can't support any private development, then that's what like public, you know, like direct grants to construction or like direct rental subsidies are best for.
Thank you. So if I'm a developer,
Mhm.
and I come to you and I need money for my project,
Sure.
the construction part of my project, and it's a 5-year note,
Yep.
you say,
Sure.
I build the building, the equity is gone up, because now I have a
Yep.
structure, I've got units, and that value has increased dramatically.
Yep.
Okay. I go to a bank, now I go to a private
Lender.
investment firm. My building, say it cost me 20 million to build,
Now it's
now
worth
it could be
30.
worth 80.
Yeah, sure.
I'm thinking like a developer. I'm gonna take as much equity out of that project as I can. And I'm gonna use the money for whatever I want.
Yep.
I may go buy a home in the vineyard. How are we gonna entice these? Because I work for a lot of developers.
Sure. Yeah.
How are we gonna entice these developers to actually take that equity
Yeah.
and keep building more of it?
Well, so this is, let me go back to, I don't know if I have this picture of this one on here. No, I don't have it on here, but, so the first project, this Housing Opportunities Commission in Montgomery County, the first project that they did, with this new fund that is now built and leased up and people live in it, and the New York Times wrote a big feature about it.
It's a great idea.
Right. No, yeah. So that project didn't actually start as a public housing authority project. That was a private developer. And this private developer had bought the land, did their architecture, engineering, entitled the land. They started moving dirt. They were ready to go, but they could not close the financing gap. They had a mortgage covering 70%, and they couldn't get anyone to invest in the rest of the project. Nobody wanted it. Housing authority, the public housing authority came in and said, I have this new fund. I'll close your gap. Here's what I'll do for you. I'll bring in, you were going to pay a private equity investor 15% return on equity for their investment. I'll cover that gap for 4% from my public fund. I'm gonna eat all your risk. I'm gonna bring property tax relief to the project because I'm a public agency, but I'm gonna be the majority owner. And the private developer was like, absolutely. Like, I just want to get this deal done. I'll develop it for fee. And now I'm out. I don't care. And they're completely happy to. Right. And so that's kind of to go back to this one, the kind of stability of housing production. So, you know, the public housing authority, they also do like fully publicly developed projects. They're doing the 1,500 unit one that I mentioned. That's a deal where the WMATA, the transit agency in the district, they own a big parcel next to a transit station. They came to the housing authority and said, you want to build a thing with me on this? And they're like, yeah, let's do it. So they do fully public projects, but they also go to private developers and say, I have better capital to close this deal since you seem to be having trouble getting it done, right? Why are you having trouble getting it done? Because the economy, because interest rates are too high, nobody wants to invest. Well, as a public agency, I know we need this housing, so I'm actually going to be there and I'm going to come invest. So that kind of gets to like one of the issues with it, right? And there's what they're finding is that a lot of these developers in the county are happy to just be fee developers for the housing, you know, the housing authority is like, the housing authority is like, I don't have 100 engineers and architects and like construction managers on staff. Be cool if I did, but I don't. So I'm going to buy that capacity from these private developers. You're just going to build this thing for me. I'll pay you, but then it's mine. And I'm going to do the affordability the way that I want. Does that kind of get to your?
Guys, it's interesting
Yeah.
concept.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd be curious, I know that this can shift place to place, and as you're saying, over time as well. But in Montgomery County, like where this is happening, what is the percentage that they're usually coming in at, like the amount of affordable housing, and what's like the highest that you've seen that?
Well, so again, it depends on a couple of things. It depends on affordable at what level, right? So if they do at like 50 to 60% AMI, which is like the HUD very low income, they'll get like roughly a third of the units. If they do it at like 80% AMI, they can get up to half, right? So there's, because basically it's like, it's up to you how you want to distribute, you know, the additional cash flow that you have from the market units, right, on top of your costs. You can, another way you could do it, right, is you could just, instead of, and the way it's kind of done in Ireland, they have a program called cost rental housing, which is one of their social housing programs in Ireland, where instead of like targeting a specific income level, they just build the units, look at what the cost was, and set the rents at exactly the cost level. And it winds up being like, you know, it's whatever, 87% AMI, but they're not like targeting income level. They're just like, I'm just going to build it and rent it at the cost that it is. And they're going to be below market rate. So there's a lot of different ways that you can do it. And then again, you can also stack it with those additional subsidies. But the one thing I will say on this point of the affordability level that I think is helpful to understand is, so right now with the low-income housing tax credit, the big federal program that pays for almost all the affordable housing in America, is we're trying to cover everyone from 0% AMI to up to 80% AMI. At current funding levels of the LIHTC, it would take 75, it would be the year 2075 before we built enough to hit everyone in that range. It's not happening. So what Montgomery County kind of discovered on purpose or an accident with this program is that I actually don't need to use any low-income housing tax credits to cover the 50 to 80% AMI range. I can cover that range of affordability in my region just with my mixed income program. And what that means is that when low-income housing tax credits get used, when the scarce federal subsidy gets used, it's directed, you can direct it to the 0 to 50, very extremely low income ranges where the federal subsidies are really needed, right? So it's like, if I can cover this 50% AMI group without spending scarce federal subsidies, why would I do that? So, and that's kind of to operationalize something like that, that's something that you need a kind of state HFA level agency to be doing, right? Which is why, we're very excited that a lot of HFAs are starting to look at this and want to operationalize that kind of targeting of subsidy.
Thank you very much. I think this has been really interesting. So I represent the city of Newton. And we're doing a lot of development. There's an attempt, to do a lot of development. And we have some very large holes in the ground at the moment that have been there for a while.
Interesting.
And I'm just wondering if the developers know about this possibility or not. And I just want to mention one thing that just happened recently, which would be interesting to you, I think, is this particular developer, I think it's in Somerville, bought a piece of property in Somerville that was it was in the paper, it was a market that hadn't been used for years. Yeah. And so he bought that property and he's gonna build, and Somerville is welcoming him in. But now Newton is wondering, well, how come? But he can go there. Right. But he's not working on the project in Newton, so I just didn't know how do you get this to the developer?
Yeah, there's it's a great question. So one thing that Montgomery County's Housing Authority has going for them is they have their real estate team is not that many people, it's like 6 people. But they all have a ton of real estate development experience and they're a really sophisticated group. Right. And so they're like, and their kind of approach to it is like, I have this fund that allows me to develop in a way that I really haven't done before as an agency. The individuals have all done real estate development, so they get it. But it allows me as a public housing authority to do something that public housing authorities generally haven't done, which is go be market participants. And that's the way they kind of look at it, right? So they go out and they look for land. They're like, that land's on the market. I want to build some public mixed income housing on that. I'm going to buy that land. Or you see a deal like this one, there's a hole in the ground at Newton and for some reason the developer's not moving. You want an agency who kind of sees this tool that's available to them and says, you know what, I see that hole in the ground and I'm going to go figure out what's up with it. Can I buy into that to make that project happen? Right. Or change it or, whatever it is. So, and that's kind of the thing is, that's kind of like the outcome that I think a lot of people want to see from this is how do we get these agencies that have this capacity and have a mission to deliver affordable housing to see themselves as having more agency in kind of helping shape the market in ways that we never really did in the United States.
You mentioned earlier, Cambridge, Somerville, Boston have more sophistication to the extent more housing authorities could participate in a statewide program. I think one of the goals is to add capacity at those housing authorities. Right?
Totally. Yeah. Right. And ideally, if a state agency runs the fund and turns this into a kind of program, it can help, push those authorities in the direction, right? If they start doing projects and they start getting deal flow and cash flow, then you're like, oh, great, I can. Like Montgomery County's real estate division, it's like 5 or 6 people. It's entirely that division is self-funded from the projects that they do, right? Like they don't make like a lot of money, but they make enough to like pay 6 people on the real estate team and like build equity.
Yeah, so they have the county system in Maryland. And
they also there's a state bill there too to kind of do state matching funds to housing authorities who are doing this.
I'm from Sudbury, which I town of like 20,000 people, and I grew up in the town of Concord, another town of similar size. And these places, they have housing authorities, they have housing trusts,
right?
But they don't have the expertise.
Totally.
So, for example, trying to develop a couple of dozen units of rental housing for the housing authority in Sudbury, reach out to Cambridge Housing Authority, pay them for their expertise to help.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah.
Things developed. And I'm scratching my head with this. It's great, places like Springfield, Cambridge, Boston, Worcester,
right,
you know, they have the staff to be able to use this stuff. The rest of the Commonwealth,
totally,
where these small cities and towns,
yeah,
no housing authority, no housing trust has the expertise itself.
right,
So there need to be some type of a system set up so we could.
totally. An expertise lending program, or I mean, this is where, you know, I don't know all of Massachusetts agencies and institutions in and out well enough to be able to say what the, you know, what the prescription is for the right arrangement. But I suspect that mass development has a ton of capacity, or a significant amount of capacity and expertise in doing these kind of projects. And mass housing obviously has housing finance experience and expertise, right? Maybe there's some arrangement for a program like this where those agencies are available to essentially take on the development side of a project in collaboration with a smaller, less sophisticated housing agency, right? Because I mean, really, like, what are we talking about? Like, to do the development work, you need underwriters who can create and review a financial model. You need somebody to manage the procurement process for hiring a construction manager and, you know, engineers and like all of that kind of thing. But, you know, like largely the agencies themselves, even in Montgomery County, they're not doing like engineering, like, or architecture in-house or anything, right? They hire somebody to do it too. So. Yeah.
Kind of off that last question here, the representative that I work for, represents a lot of smaller towns.
Mhm.
And the housing projects that are currently going on there, they're not nearly the size of, some of the ones you've mentioned. Is there minimum size for projects for it to really?
Yeah, no, again, it's kind of like that rule of thumb earlier, like if there's private development that's happening in your jurisdiction at a certain size, it's probably being financed in a very similar way to other larger developments. And the way housing real estate development is financed is pretty standard, right? I mean, there's always weird projects with weird funny things in them, but like no, and I know both Atlanta and in Montgomery County, they have some smaller, like, you know, like 16 to 24 unit little things planned, right? Like townhouses and stuff like that. It works. I mean, you get less economies of scale doing a big project, but it's not a huge deal. Yeah.
Mentioned that this was the first time public housing authority has entered into the market. How
Kind of, yeah.
it's more mixed housing. Yeah, residents have been more accepting to having low income housing in like in their backyard.
Yeah, no, I haven't seen any kind of research or studies. I mean, you know, I talked to the people in Atlanta and Montgomery County that run the program and they're like, it's working great, you know, but no, but we've talked to Furman Center at NYU, which I don't know if any housing buffs in here probably know of them. They do like a lot of kind of housing research on new programs. They're looking into like doing some studies on the mixed income outcomes of like Montgomery County's projects. But I mean, there's mixed income projects that get built all over the country anyway. This is just like a different way of doing them. It's again additive instead of just chopping up the pie different. Yeah.
This program be translated into like home buying instead of rental programs? Is there?
That's a great question.
First time to
yeah, a few of the different jurisdictions we're working with are interested in trying to do a kind of limited equity home ownership type piece to something like this, for like, you know, limited equity co-op condos, these kind of things. Nobody has put the pedal to the metal on that one yet, but I think it's a cool idea, and you know, I would be happy to help figure out how to do it. Anybody want to take those steps,
Is there any, it sounds like the loans are just for new construction. Is there any interest in like
preservation.
existing public housing with it or like, is that?
Yeah, I mean,
viable?
I'm going to meet up with Kenzie Bach at Boston Housing Authority later today. She has, I don't want to like speak for her, the agency, but they're doing a number of like kind of preservation mixed income deals right now. And she's interested in approaches like this to help them facilitate more of that kind of work that they're doing. So yes, I mean, there's ways to do kind of preservation type things.
And if I can just add, we had the experience in Somerville with the Clarendon Hill project, which was about 225 state public housing units. No real clear path to renovating them. And so then the housing committee worked on this. POA and other organizations went out, put a deal together. They had to go to Redgate, Gate Financial, private real estate investors, and get $30 million of capital. And so certainly the idea has, and we've been in conversation with the city of Somerville on this. What if the Somerville Housing Authority didn't have to go out and get that $30 million private capital, which was frankly painful, right? Because there was then, that need to pencil the project out and return to those investors, return on their equity. And so just for everyone who's familiar with it, the Somerville Clarendon Hill project, about 225 state public housing units. And now the final result would be 500 new units, where essentially, I don't have the exact numbers, state public housing units are replaced with voucher-based units. And new units are essentially all market rate units, which are what is needed to deliver that return on investment. And so the thought has emerged, obviously, this is a thought. If the social housing production revolving loan fund was available, the Somerville Housing Authority could potentially draw upon that, do the same exact project, but instead of adding only market rate units, they could build some affordability into it, as you described. So
yeah,
that actually was a concept, when we first started working on the bill and we were talking to legislators, we had some great feedback where people said, oh, I've heard that we have an $8 or $10 billion backlog of state public housing maintenance. It's a little interesting that you're here saying, let's expand the notion of public development. And I started thinking, wait a minute, maybe this idea can help with that backlog.
Totally.
In addition to, not as the only way, I know there's other ways we will try to address that backlog, but the backlog is so big that this could be a way to help address that.
Yeah, and that's, New York City Housing Authority is deploying a bunch of different kind of tools to help deal with their backlog. And we're doing an event down in Montgomery County 2 weeks from today, actually. And they have folks coming down, right? Because they're interested in, can this help me address my backlog? Right, so.
So we're at 12:05. Are there one or two other questions, or we got them all? All right.
Cool.
Should we call it? Thank you all so much.
Welcome to be here. And get in touch with Mike has my contact info, and I'm sure can.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone.
Is that Tom?
Yeah, no, Mike's fine. Mike's fine.
Thanks a lot. Really great.
Thank you for being here. Sorry I was a little late.
Nice to meet you too.
My name is Sarah King. I'm in the housing and